Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In this short presentation, we will look at various aspects of the accountability as per the Quran. Every cause has an effect, or the law of requital. We can also call it what we sow, so shall we reap. There are three spheres of the working of the law of requital in human life. First is, in the physical sphere, every cause has an effect. For example, if I put my finger in fire, it will burn it and I will suffer the consequences. In the social sphere, the law of requital works in the form of civil law. For example, in all nation states there are laws which citizens must follow, otherwise they will get punished. Of course, this will depend on whether someone is caught or not. In the moral sphere, the law of requital is seen at its best. Anyone's actions besides producing effects in a society also produce effects within him or her, changing his/her self for better or worse. External factors have no effect on a man's personality. Though subtle, the working of the law of requital in this sphere is relentless. The Quran has very clearly stated that the purpose of the human creation is accountability. In this verse, which is shown here, it says, Allah created the heavens and the earth for just ends, and in order that each self finds the recompense of what it has earned, and none of them be wronged. Indeed, the rest of the Quran explains how this system of accountability or the law of requital works. There are 3 points to note. First, reference to the creation of the visible universe as an evidence. Second, reference to the creation of human beings with a free will to create a self and holding it accountable. And third, reference to a system which is based on justice to provide assurance of its working 24/7. Next slide outlines the points which are important to understand how this accountability functions in our life. The first point is there is a time gap between a cause and its effect. Next is creation of the ability to make choices, that is mind and its tools. Third is creation of competitive environment, which can be physical and non-physical. Then is creation of physical death. Then the law of requital and its working. And the Quran, the revelation as an external standard for guidance. First, let us look at the time interval. The Quran says, if Allah had seized human beings for their wrongdoings instantaneously, there would not have remained any living being on the face of the earth. But that is not His way. He gives them respite for an appropriate term, and when that term comes to an end, they will not be able to delay or advance it by a moment. There are 3 aspects to note. There is a reference to the scaling of human deeds which decide the consequences and their timings. And this is in reference to wrongdoings, for example. Reference to the collective nature of the law and applicable for all times on universal basis. What it says is that the moment we have committed a deed in the moral sphere, we may not have immediate consequences, and the consequences could be delayed for some time before their effects show up in our later part of our life. In the next slide, there are 3 verses quoted here which show that we have the ability to make choices. In the first verse, He who created death and life so that you get an opportunity to test your own self-development, and He is Aziz and Ghafoor. In the second verse, it says, to any of you that chooses to press forward or to lag behind. And in the third verse, each self will know what it has sent forward and what it has kept back. The first verse explains the purpose of human life and death. The 2 divine attributes point to the functioning of the law of requital in the world, that is, power to implement and conduct this aspect of accountability. The next 2 verses refer to choices each one of us makes to live our life. So it is important that we should understand the practical application of this in our life. We know we can make choices, we can select a particular course of action, but we do not we cannot change the consequences of following a particular course of action. In the next slide, there are two verses quoted which indicate the creation of physical death. The Quran says that every self shall have a taste of death, and only on the day of judgment shall you be paid your full recompense. Only he who is saved far from the fire and admitted to the garden will have attained the object of life. For the life of this world is but goods and chattels of deception. In the next verse, every self shall have a taste of death. In the end, to us shall ye be brought back. Please note here the relationship between the self and the physical death. The self will taste it and then move on. In the next verse, in the next slide, there are two verses given. In the first verse, for each self there are guardians in succession, before and behind him. They guard him by command of Allah. Allah does not change a people's lot unless they change what is in their own selves. But when Allah wills a people's punishment as a consequence of their deeds, there can be no turning it back, nor will they find besides him any to protect. And the next verse, it says, it was we who created man, and we know what dark suggestions his self, that is his thought-based self, makes to him, for we are nearer to him than his jugular vein. The Quran says in 57 chapter 4th verse, Allah is with you wherever you are. This is a very important aspect of the working of the law of requital, pointing to our inner thought process. Continuing from the previous slide, there are three more verses quoted here as a reference. In the first verse, and if anyone earns wrong, he earns it against his own self, for Allah is full of knowledge and wisdom. Nay, man will be evidence against himself. And the third verse, say, shall I seek my cherisher other than Allah, when he is the cherisher of all things? Every self draws the meed of its acts on none other but itself. No bearer of burdens can bear the burden of another. Your goal in the end is towards Allah. He will tell you the truth of the things wherein ye dispute it. This is a very important aspect, and we can, if we look at our own thought process, that is inner thought process, we can find out that all decisions are made inside our mind and before we carry out these decisions. Some of the decisions we make and we may not carry out and might carry out many years later. So our thought process defines us at any point in time. The next slide outlines some of the points which in relation to guidance. For example, the Quran explains the purpose of human creation, that is accountability. It deals with the human thought process as a function of mind to create a self. Human beings do not think like the Quran, hence the need for the guidance. This is an important point, that we do not think like the Quran and we do not have any inner guidance. Therefore, we need the revelation as an external standard in the form of the permanent values. The Quran explains various human models to illustrate the guidance. It very clearly demonstrates that people in the past who were righteous have carried out and lived their life within these permanent values, and they benefited from their thoughts and actions. It refers to various permanent values and their purpose. It provides indications about the life in the hereafter, and it explains the effects as consequences if the permanent values are not followed. The next slide shows schematically the difference between the physical death and the self. If we look at the first part, the death ends the physical part of ourself, while the created self, through our own efforts, will go beyond death. The self is created using our mental faculties, for example, metacognition, which is thinking about thinking, our memory, emotions, and by living life within the domain of the permanent values. The second slide is also drawn schematically where we use our mind, which consists of our strong sense of identity, our emotions, metacognition, that is thinking about thinking, and our memory, and we use this and live our physical life by interacting with other human beings and create a self. And this self can be Quranic or non-Quranic. If it is based on the permanent values, that is, we have lived our life within the permanent values, then we get a different self than the one which we do not live within the permanent values. And before concluding this presentation, hell and heaven, as per the Quran, are not places of abode, but these are the states of the human self. For example, in the first verse, the example of the paradise which the righteous are promised, beneath it flow rivers. Perpetual is the enjoyment thereof, and the shade therein. Such is the end of the righteous, and the end of unbelievers in the fire. Now see, the term used is example here. And the next two verses, the fire of Allah kindled, that is the negative consequences of our deeds, which does mount to the hearts. So reference to the internal state of the self. To conclude this short presentation, first, every moral act works consequential changes in the human self. Our voluntary deeds influence our self. We are responsible for our actions and must accept their consequences. We cannot shift the responsibility to anyone else, because all changes are within our own selves. We are a complete unit. Next, helping others within the domain of the permanent values results in the development of ourself. Indifference or denial of the permanent values leads to the disintegration of the self. And finally, the Quran provides the guidance as an external option. It is our choice to accept it or refuse it. And finally, these are two references, and there is a book titled A Challenge to Religion. It is available free at tuluislam.org. And there is also an exposition of the Holy Quran, which is available free again at tuluislam.org. Thank you.